Hi friends, write in the comments what city you are from. Perhaps you also had similar stories. It is very interesting to know what happened in your corner of the world. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it, share your thoughts or stories in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. There are more exciting and unexpected stories ahead. All characters and events described in this story are fictitious. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Do not judge strictly. John Walker awoke to the first pink rays of dawn, which softly filtered through the thin translucent curtains of their cozy bedroom, casting warm, watercolor shadows on the floor and walls. The room was filled with a soft light, as if nature itself was carefully wrapping them in a canvas of peace and calm. The air was fresh, damp from the ocean coolness, and in it hung a barely perceptible aroma of salt, mixed with the smell of warm wood, from which the floor of the bedroom was made. Somewhere in the distance, birds were chirping, and this quiet morning chorus seemed to be part of the dream, not disturbing the silence, but only emphasizing it. The light was warm and gentle, like the touch of memories of carefree summer mornings in childhood, when the sun glided across the curtains of the parental home, awakening the kindest feelings. It spread across the light walls as if an impressionist painter was moving his brush, glided across the snow-white bedspread, creating golden pink streaks on it, and settled on the face of Emily, his wife, his support, his heart. Her features were soft, relaxed in the morning peace. Even in sleep, she seemed filled with light, as if the dawn itself was born in her breath. Her breathing was even and melodic, almost synchronized with the soft rustle of the surf, barely discernible in the morning silence. It was like the breath of nature, serene, deep, confident. A cool, salty wind blew from the shores of the Pacific Ocean, and its touch penetrated through the slightly open window, filling the room with movement, a living lightness. The curtains moved, as if they were breathing with Emily, dancing in the wind gently, unhurriedly, almost poetically. The waves lapped softly in the distance, and this sound dissolved into the space of the house, as if the walls were made not of brick, but of memories and silence. Emily's chestnut curls, scattered across the pillow, shone in the rays of the rising sun with golden reflections, like silk threads woven from the morning light. John admired the way the sunspots played on her skin, on the delicate line of her collarbones, on the curve of her shoulder, on her slightly parted lips. At that moment, she seemed not just beautiful, she was perfection, the embodiment of the morning world, fragile and infinitely close. He felt a familiar warmth fill his chest, a feeling that didn't require words and didn't need to be analyzed. It was love, calm and sure, like an old song that always sounds inside you, even when you don't hear it out loud. He reached out to her quietly, touching her shoulder carefully, with an almost sacred trepidation, so as not to wake her abruptly, not to frighten this perfect moment. "Good morning," he whispered with tenderness in his voice, watching Emily's eyelashes flutter and her lips slowly spread into a lazy, still half-asleep smile. He leaned closer, feeling her breath, fresh and calm, and added a little more quietly, "You look wonderful today, like a ray of light in this room." She opened her eyes, and the fog of sleep was still floating in them. Her smile grew a little wider. She raised herself on her elbow and, yawning, reached out to him, touching his cheek with her warm palm. Her fingers were soft, like those of a person who had just woken up, and she smelled of something familiar, a little vanilla, a little salty night air. "Thank you," she muttered, slightly hoarsely in her sleep, "but I'm afraid I look like a beach witch right now." "A witch, perhaps, from the beach," John chuckled, touching her forehead, "but definitely a bewitching one." She giggled and moved closer to him, settling herself against his chest, pressing her cheek against his shoulder. "I don't want to get up. Can I cancel the morning? Just stay here, listen to you breathe, and not rush anywhere?" Tempting. "But didn't you say that today was your most important shoot of the year?" John gently hugged her, stroking her back. "The photographer whom you called a legend and a capricious celebrity." "Ugh, Carmichael," she moaned, burying her face in his neck. "Don't remind me. I've been going over in my head all night again about what I'm going to wear, how I'm going to stand, what he's going to say. Now I just want to forget all about it and stay in my pajamas." Do you want me to make you breakfast? Something motivating, like pancakes with caramel and my sincere compliments. You've already motivated me simply by offering breakfast. She laughed again, a little hoarsely, with that morning warmth that only comes from being in bed next to your loved one. But compliments can be for dessert too. Agreed. Then you are my queen of the set, even if you go there in your pajamas and with disheveled hair. If this keeps up, you're going to convince me to cancel the photo shoot and stay here with you all day, Emily muttered, clinging closer to him. I wouldn't mind. For a moment, they were both silent. The sea was still roaring outside the window, and in this silence, filled with their breath and the sun, there was everything love, trust, and the endless morning that they didn't want to let go. There was some elusive harmony between them from the very beginning. It didn't require words. It didn't need explanations. Since they met at university, going through exams, late-night conversations, moving, and first rented apartments, they became something more than just a couple. They became an ingrained part of each other's lives, branches of the same tree, inseparable. Emily had an important photo shoot today. Famous Los Angeles photographer Mark Carmichael had agreed to work with her, an event she had been preparing for with excitement and trepidation. John had known about it for weeks. He had supported her in every endeavor, even those that seemed dubious to him. His faith in her was unconditional, almost childlike in its purity. He glanced at the phone on the nightstand. 6:30. The house was silent, except for the morning birdsong and the soft hum of the coffee maker on the timer in the kitchen. It was that rare silence in which every sound seemed significant. No warning signs, no premonitions. But in the very stillness of the morning, there was another shadow, a shadow of feigned calm, as if the whole world were holding its breath before a sudden storm. John, without realizing it, held his breath for a moment, as if he expected that there was something else behind this harmony. Is something wrong? Emily asked, propping herself up on her elbow and looking at him carefully. There was a note of alarm in her voice that hadn't been there a second ago. He shook himself, smiled as if driving away an inner doubt, and, leaning down, kissed her on the forehead. No, it's okay, he replied tenderly. I was just thinking about how lucky I am to have you. Emily smiled again, wider, with that familiar twinkle in her eyes that always made John's heart flutter. She laid her head on his shoulder, and there was more trust in her silence than in 100 words. She knew he was her rock, and he knew her happiness was his mission. John got out of bed, stretched, feeling his muscles stretch pleasantly, and quietly left the bedroom, leaving the door slightly open behind him. He liked to watch the house while it was still asleep. These were his moments of solitary morning ritual. The kitchen smelled of freshly ground coffee. He poured himself a cup in his favorite ceramic mug with a worn inscription. The best is yet to come, given to Emily for their 3rd anniversary. The warmth of the drink burned pleasantly against his palms as he slowly inhaled the aroma, reminding himself that every morning was an opportunity to start over. The open kitchen window looked out onto a deserted street. A light fog still hung over the asphalt, and the first rays of light cast long shadows from the trees swaying in the wind. The radio quietly played an old jazz composition. The saxophone sounded melancholic, almost philosophical. He put the cup down on the table and glanced at his laptop. The screen flickered, notifying him of a new email. The letter was from Emily. Please don't forget to pick up the contract documents this evening. Attached to the letter was a photograph, an old one but a favorite. The two of them, against the backdrop of a sun-drenched beach, hugging each other, laughing. Emily is wearing bright glasses and a light, flowery dress, her hair blowing in the sea breeze. John, with a careless stubble and a wide smile, holds her shoulders, as if to say to the world, "This is my happiness." He involuntarily touched the screen with his fingers, as if he wanted to be transported back to that moment frozen in the picture. He still felt the same feeling in his chest, as then love, simple, quiet, but unimaginably deep. But even in this idyll, in this picture of a warm morning, like a vague ripple on the surface of water, a feeling of anxiety arose inside him, subtle but persistent, like an untold secret that was about to be revealed. He did not know where it came from and did not want to attach any importance to it. Perhaps it was just overwork. Perhaps a game of the subconscious. He closed his laptop, finished his coffee, and told himself that this was just an ordinary day, just like yesterday, and everything would be fine. But they didn't know it yet. In a few hours, everything would change. Their world, built on love, trust, and understanding, would face something that was impossible to prepare for. And the morning of trust will forever remain in memory as the last moment of serenity. The sun was setting toward midday when Emily pulled up to Mark Carmichael's studio in downtown Los Angeles. The studio's huge glass building reflected the yellow-blue sky like a giant crystal, and its walls shimmered with patches of light, as if they were holding a tiny sun inside. The muffled hum of cameras could already be heard in the lobby, the soft clicks of shutters interspersed with the careful whispers of a makeup artist and the rustle of fabric. The air was filled with the smell of coffee, hairspray, and light perfumes, all mixing to create a special atmosphere of backstage fashion. Emily took a deep breath, containing her nerves, and walked into the room. Her heels clicked softly on the smooth concrete floor as she walked past assistants and models. Today, she was supposed to be shooting a fashion brand's new collection, a bold, modern collection with vintage aesthetics. "Good morning," said a familiar, confident voice. Mark Carmichael was walking toward her. He was a tall, athletic man with tan skin, short brown hair, and a light beard. His gaze was attentive and penetrating, like an artist studying a canvas before applying his first brushstroke. He wore a black turtleneck that showed off his broad shoulders, dark jeans, and a silver chain around his neck with a small camera as a pendant, a symbol of his dedication to his profession. Approaching her in the center of the area, he adjusted the curled lock of hair on her shoulder with light, almost brotherly care. "It's good to see you," he added, shaking her hand firmly but gently. There was a mixture of respect and anticipation in his tone. He believed in her talent and knew that today they would create something special. "Today we're going to try new looks, a little bolder than usual. Ready?" "Of course, Mark," Emily replied with a slight smile. Her voice shook a little less than it had that morning when she stood in front of the mirror, but her confidence was already beginning to awaken. The excitement had not disappeared, but it had become part of the electric charge in the air. She trusted Mark, his professional instinct, his unerring understanding of light, mood, frame, all of this was inspiring. "Excellent," he said, nodding approvingly. His eyes lingered on her face for a second, as if he was already running through the shots in his mind. "We'll do a simple portrait first. Soft, daylight. I want to capture your naturalness. And then—" He squinted slightly with a slight grin. "Then we'll try something bolder, with skin, contrasts, highlights, a little provocation." He pointed to the makeup table, where a stylist was already waiting with a set of brushes, jars, and an eyeshadow palette that looked like an artist's box. Emily nodded and headed that way, feeling her inner tension turn into a slight excitement as she walked. The day was just beginning. The makeup artist carefully completed Emily's makeup. Her skin acquired a matte shine, her eyes were emphasized with dark gray shadows, and her lips were painted with a translucent gloss. When she looked at herself in the mirror, her eyes lit up with a slight determination. A new challenge was ahead. "I'm setting up the light," Mark nodded and, without losing his concentration, headed towards his camera, deftly avoiding tripods, hanging wires, and reflectors. He looked collected, almost detached, like a conductor before the start of a symphony, when every element must be exactly in its place. His fingers deftly ran through the settings: ISO, shutter speed, white balance, everything under control. Emily stood in the center of the room, surrounded by a high semicircle of lighting fixtures. Soft artificial light had already begun to play on her skin, emphasizing the porcelain texture of her face. She hesitantly adjusted the thin strap of her ash-pink dress, which flowed softly over her body like morning mist. The material swayed almost weightlessly with movement, creating a feeling of lightness and elusive grace. "Relax your shoulders. Breathe deeply," came the calm voice of the assistant standing next to her. "Imagine that you are dancing in the sea breeze." Emily took a deep breath. She imagined her bare feet touching the warm sand, a gentle breeze ruffling her hair, the sun touching her skin, softly and almost imperceptibly. The camera clicked experimentally, the reflectors flickering for a moment, casting soft shadows on the walls. "Good, keep your back slightly arched," Mark instructed, his eyes glued to the viewfinder. His voice was both precise and inspiring. "Lift your chin like this. Now exhale. Easy. Imagine you're not posing, just being in the moment." Emily closed her eyes, taking in the atmosphere. She arched her back slightly, allowing her body to assume a more flexible, sensual pose. The waves of her chestnut hair brushed softly against her bare shoulders, creating an impression of effortless beauty. The flash illuminated her silhouette, the delicate lines of her neck, the graceful curve of her waist, her calm but confident pose. She slowly opened her eyes. Her gaze was focused not on the lens, but on something far away, as if she could see the horizon. Her smile was not only soft, but also an inner strength, a confidence that gradually revealed itself with each frame. "Yes, that's it," Mark said approvingly, raising his eyebrows slightly. "You do it just great." He pressed the shutter again. The camera took on a life of its own, clicking rhythmically, capturing every gesture, every subtle change of expression on her face. The crew froze, not disturbing the magic of the moment. Even the assistants stood quietly, watching Emily transform from model to muse to living work of art. "Do you feel it?" Mark said quietly, lowering the camera for a moment. "This isn't just filming. This is when a person becomes part of the light." "Let's try the next image," Mark suggested after a while, exhaling as if releasing the tension of the previous scene. He approached the monitor, ran his eyes over the shots, and excitement flashed in his eyes. The photographer had caught the wave, and now he wanted more, deeper, bolder. Emily left the frame and headed to the wardrobe, where her assistant already held a new set for her. She took off her light, airy dress, replacing it with a sports top and short asphalt-colored shorts that tightly hugged her slender body. The image became minimalistic, emphatically dynamic, and at the same time, thanks to her plasticity, did not lose grace. Mark had meanwhile changed the scene. The white background was replaced by a deep, dark gray, almost black, creating a sense of privacy and intimacy. He had changed the arrangement of the lights. Now the sources were harder, more dramatic, with a contrast that emphasized the relief of the body. "It's bolder," he said calmly, coming closer and holding her gaze. His voice was soft but confident. "Leave the top. Don't be afraid. Your vulnerability is also part of your strength." Emily held her breath for a moment. She nodded, as if giving permission not only to him but to herself. With a slight tremor in her fingers, she removed her top, revealing elegant, graceful, flesh-colored underwear. Her back was open, like a canvas inviting the light to dialogue. The skin softly played in the directed rays, the relief of the shoulder blades, the curve of the waist, the slight tension of the muscles, all this created an image almost sculptural. Mark took a few steps back, came up and lightly touched her shoulder. Turned to the camera, now slightly to the left. "Excellent. Hands more freely. You are not posing, you are breathing. Let yourself be." She took a deep breath. Her gaze slid over the lens, over the light, over the silence in the room. She slowly lifted one hand up, letting it float through the air, then ran it down her neck, along the line of her collarbones. The camera clicked, capturing every movement lively, fluid, as if Emily were dancing without music, driven only by her inner impulse. In the next pose, she took a step forward, dropped to one knee, and extended her other leg out to the side. Her toes lightly touched the floor as her body curved in a fluid arc, a semi-acrobatic pose that was both tense and graceful. In another shot, she stood up, spread her arms out to the sides like wings, and closed her eyes, her face seemingly turned toward an invisible light. Mark leaned forward slightly, exchanged glances with his assistant, and motioned for him to bring the props. A minute later, a thin goblet filled with clear water was placed in Emily's hands. She held it with both hands like a jewel, then pressed it to her chest, tilting her head to the side. light shone through the glass, refracting off her skin in rainbow reflections. In one shot, the water trembled with her breath. In another, it trickled down her fingers in a thin stream. Every movement became a phrase in a wordless story. The camera clicked, a hidden silence filled the space, and it seemed as if time had stopped only she, her body, and the light. "Let's try a different mood, a more sensual one," Mark said, pulling the camera away and looking at Emily for a second. His voice was a little lower, warmer, with a hint of anticipation, as if he were discovering a new facet, not only in the shoot, but in her as well. He stepped forward and changed the light. The directional softbox was now angled, creating a play of shadows on the floor and Emily's body, adding volume, depth, intimacy. The atmosphere became thicker, the air denser, like before a thunderstorm. The space was filled with a quiet tension that did not frighten, but attracted. Emily nodded silently, as if she understood without words. She came closer to the source of light, and it enveloped her like a warm veil. On a wooden table covered with a rough cloth stood a glass of water. She leaned on the edge of the table with her hands thin, graceful, but now full of inner strength. Her fingers lightly squeezed the edge, her back arched, and her whole body seemed to speak of an internal heat. She looked into the glass, squinting, and saw her reflection there different, unfamiliar, like the reflection of the heroine of someone else's daring story. In her eyes, slowly but vividly, two states mixed, confusion and passion. Doubt, slight excitement, and at the same time, a spark, desire, a desire to be seen as she really is. The camera came to life again, puffed, as if it felt this internal turning point. Flashes captured her silhouette, her half-lit back, a drop of water trembling on the edge of a glass. Emily's hair fell on her shoulders, slightly disheveled, giving the image liveliness and frankness. She turned her head, slowly, theatrically, and looked straight into the lens. There was no longer fear in that look, only acceptance. Her lips parted, her breathing ragged, her whole body frozen at that point of contact between her and the viewer. Mark lowered the camera, and there was a moment of silence. Then he exhaled with visible relief and satisfaction, as if he had finished an important monologue. "Good," he said, stepping back. The light settled on her skin, softly outlining her collarbones and the curve of her hips. "We got everything." He came closer, put his hand on her shoulder lightly, in a friendly manner, but with respect, as if he was thanking her. "You're absolutely stunning today," he said, looking straight into her eyes. "These aren't just stills. This is a story, and you're alive, strong, real in it." Emily didn't answer right away. She stood in the light, holding a glass, a drop of water on her finger, and her eyelashes trembling. She felt a feeling slowly blossoming in her chest, not even pride, but a deep, almost quiet confidence. She had gone through something important, and in this light she had finally become herself. There was a short pause, still filled with the tension of the shoot that had just ended. The lights were slowly dimming. One by one, the technicians were turning off their equipment, and the room was beginning to return to its normal state. Assistants were talking in low voices, makeup artists were already putting brushes and palettes back in their cases, and only Emily was still standing at the table, as if she had not yet fully left her role. Mark, with his camera on his belt, watched her for a few seconds before stepping forward. His movements were calm, almost intimate. He wasn't just walking like a photographer. He was walking like a person who had something personal to say. "You know," he said quietly, his voice no longer like a professional giving orders, but soft, almost warm. "After a shoot like this, I usually throw a little cocktail party for the crew. It's sort of a tradition. We have a great view of the city on the roof. The sunset should be incredible. How about a cocktail?" Emily frowned slightly, looking down at herself. She was still wearing her gym shorts, a plain white tank top, and her legs were tired, with a light dusting of powder from the previous scenes. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and her skin was shiny from the makeup and the spotlights. She ran a hand down her cheek, as if coming back to reality. "I'm tired as it is, Mark," she said, smiling uncertainty. "I think I could just fall asleep right here." She turned slightly, glancing at the mirror behind the makeup table. In the reflection, she was not the same girl who had come in that morning. Something in her gaze had changed. Maybe it was lightness, or maybe a strange maturity, like after a frank conversation alone with herself. Mark nodded without insisting. "Of course I understand," he said, with a slight smile. "But if you change your mind, let's meet in the lobby in half an hour. We'll go up together. I'll ask my assistant to bring you something more comfortable. There won't be anyone there in the evening. Just the team, the sunset, the music, the glasses, and you can relax. You deserve it." Emily hesitated, then looked at him with gratitude for his tact, for not pushing. She nodded, more quietly. "Probably. Why not?" Mark bowed his head slightly, and for a moment the same concentration with which he looked into the lens flashed across his face, attentive, penetrating. "Okay," he said. "Then in half an hour." He walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts, and she, remaining at the mirror, still held the glass in her hands, in which there was one drop of water left transparent, like her mood at that moment. When the crew had dispersed to their cars and the bustle of the shooting day had finally died down, Emily, having slightly changed into a light ivory linen dress and comfortable sandals, went up to the roof of the old loft. The elevator to the top floor rose slowly, creaking on old guides, and with each floor a slight excitement or anticipation grew in her chest. The roof was spacious and cozy, with a wooden deck and many hanging garlands, flickering with warm light. On one side there were wide leather chairs and wicker poufs, on the other a long wooden table covered with a linen tablecloth, on which there were already snacks, fruits, bottles of champagne, and glasses. The sky above Los Angeles was ablaze with the last rays of sunset, a deep pink-orange light shimmering off the glass facades of the surrounding buildings, turning the city into a living painting. A thin evening breeze brought coolness and the faint scent of jasmine from the potted plants that lined the fence. Several people, familiar from filming and other projects, had already gathered. They were sitting and standing in a relaxed pose. Some were chatting, some were already drinking champagne, some were thoughtfully looking at the horizon, where the sky was turning into a silvery haze. The atmosphere was almost theatrical, a light afterglow of a big creative day, when everyone was slightly tired, but happily relaxed. Mark, noticing Emily, immediately came up to her and gently took her hand, leading her towards the group. "Emily, these are my friends who occasionally participate in our projects," he said with a slight smile. "Vince, Chris, Rick, I assure you, they know a thing or two about a good evening. You certainly won't be bored with them." "Hi," Vince nodded, looking her straight in the eye. His dark brown hair fell casually over his forehead, and there was something cinematic about it. He looked confident, a little cocky, but not brazen, more like a man who was used to charming. "I'm glad we finally met. Mark told me a lot about you, but you're even more interesting than I imagined." Chris, short and wiry, with clear gray eyes and a short haircut, added, smiling energetically, "Yes, I heard that too. And today you were just fired. Especially the scene with the glass, powerful. Very cinematic, honest." "Thank you," Emily replied, slightly embarrassed, but feeling her shoulders begin to relax. At that moment, Vince came closer and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. His touch was unobtrusive, more symbolic, but warm. He looked into her eyes with a half smile. "Don't be bored. I'm sure this evening will be fun. You know, people here are informal. Everyone's a little on the edge, but in a good way." She smiled again. The awkwardness still hung in her, but it wasn't pressing, it was melting like ice in a glass. The lightness of the evening wind, the open sky, and the leisurely rhythm of the music barely coming from the speakers, all this seemed to muffle the anxious thoughts. Mark motioned for her to sit at one of the tables. There were already tall glasses of champagne on a white tray, one of which was lazily bubbled, reflecting the garlands. Emily sat down, side by side with Vince and Chris, across from Mark. Someone brought a cheese plate. Someone turned up the music a little louder, jazz with a lounge feel, light, playful. In conversations at the table, funny stories from the shoot emerged. Someone began to parody models, and someone shared impressions of the latest project in Tokyo. Laughter became sincere, movements relaxed. The evening seemed to open up like a night flower. Vince poured Emily a glass. "Here's to your health," he said. She took a sip of the light drink, feeling the alcohol spread through her body in warm ripples. They discussed the shoot slowly, then moved on to more personal topics. Travel, familiar faces. "Well, she is beautiful," Emily heard a strange voice say. Another man stood in front of her, tall and curly-haired. "I'm Jason. Nice to meet you." She blushed slightly and smiled. Jason sat down next to her, continuing the conversation. Gradually, the conversation became more and more confidential. Someone suggested dancing, and a Latin American melody began to play. Emily stood up and moved easily to the beat of the music. Her movements were fluid, effortless, as if she weren't dancing, but letting her body do the talking. The music flowed softly from the speakers, its rhythm warm and sensual, and the evening already seemed almost like a dream to her. The men around her kept up. Vince, standing slightly behind her, matched her rhythm, his hand occasionally brushing her waist. Chris winked as he passed her the glass, laughing when Emily stumbled slightly on a turn. It all seemed like an easy, trusting game, almost a teenage flirtation, nothing forced, just the energy of the moment. Someone dimmed the lights, and the shadows from the garlands on the roofs played on their faces. The music died down, but not immediately. At first it became a little quieter, as if it died away along with their breathing. Mark came closer, leaned towards her ear, and with a light, almost elusive smile whispered, "Come with us." He nodded toward the stairs leading into the loft. "I want to show you one room. It's cozy, just the three of us." He spoke simply, without pressure. His gaze was direct, but not intrusive. Vince and Rick stood close, exchanging glances. There was no threat in their postures, only something playful, warm, insistently calm, like people who had long been familiar with such evenings. Emily felt her heart give a little jump. Doubt flickered, not as anxiety, but as foreboding. But there was something else, too, an odd sense of stepping over a threshold into something new, uncertain but exciting. She nodded, not quite sure what she was accepting, and followed them, her bare feet on the wooden floor. They entered a dimly lit room, where candles burned dimly. Shadows danced on the walls, soft light illuminated sofas, pillows, woven rugs, and people's faces, familiar and unfamiliar, were lost in the semi-darkness. The atmosphere here was different, not noisy and cheerful, but more concentrated, intimate. The music was muffled, like an echo of distant excitement. Vince and Rick stayed with her. Jason, tall, broad-shouldered, with a velvety voice, came closer and, without taking his eyes off her, said quietly, "Take off your shirt, to make it more comfortable, only if you want." It no longer sounded like an order, but more like an invitation, a step that didn't come with pressure, but left room for a response. Emily froze, her heart beating a little faster. She looked into his eyes, and although her fingers trembled, she felt no fear, only warmth, excitement, a desire to try, to feel, to be. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you for your trust. I will rewrite this piece with an emphasis on the atmosphere, Emily's inner feelings, and her psychological state, adding gradualness and internal conflict while maintaining expressiveness and emotional depth." As she carefully removed the tank top, the straps slid off her shoulders, and the cool air washed over her skin like a thin silk scarf. Everything that happened next ceased to be a simple sequence of movements. It was more of a sensation. Soft flashes of light on the skin, barely noticeable touches, the sounds of breathing, and the rustle of fabric, which intertwined in a barely audible rhythm. Emily felt as if the space around her had changed, darkened, shrank, became closer. In the half-light of the candles, every touch took on an almost hypnotic meaning. Jason, standing behind her, gently took her hands, ran them down her back, as if he wanted to feel what she was feeling. "Relax," he whispered, his voice soft but very close, almost inside. "Don't be afraid." Emily tried to obey the call, but something vague and unsettling stirred inside her. Her head suddenly began to spin slightly, not sharply, not painfully, but as if from a sudden rush of heat or lack of air. Everything seemed slightly elevated above reality. The candles were brighter, the shadows were deeper, the touches were stronger. She clenched her teeth, trying to keep her balance, but her body wasn't obeying the way it used to. It responded to every movement: hands on her waist, a hand on her hip, lips sliding down her neck with a treacherous but alluring response. Emily's fingers involuntarily dug into the edge of the couch, as if she were trying to hold on to the point between herself and what was happening to her. Her eyes widened from fear, from excitement, perhaps from both at once. Everything was mixed up. Her pulse quickened, her breathing became uneven, the boundaries of her body seemed to dissolve, and instead of thoughts there remained only sensation. "You're gorgeous," Vince whispered, leaning close to her ear. His lips were warm, his voice enveloping. Emily shuddered. A shudder ran through her body, light and deep, like cold ripples in warm water. Something inside her told her this might be too much, too fast, too bright, not her. And yet, she didn't want to stop. The attention of these men, their warmth, their delight in her body, in herself, was like a drug. She liked feeling wanted, the center of this moment, alive, full of sensations. "Yes," she agreed, barely audibly, almost not recognizing her own voice. There was uncertainty in it, but also a desire to stay in this storm for a moment longer. The evening silence enveloped them, and in this silence everything sounded especially clear: breathing, whispering, heartbeat. Emily was lost in this moment between herself and who she could be, between fear and attraction. And although part of her still hesitated, another reached out to meet. John was sitting in his desk chair, staring at his computer screen, when a single, short notification beep rang out in the quiet office. It was a familiar sound, nothing foreshadowed trouble. He lazily reached for his mouse, intending to simply delete another email with advertising. But then his gaze caught on the subject line, and his heart began to pound faster. "John, have you seen her?" Everything inside him tightened. The strange combination of a personal address and an alarming phrase instantly fueled his anxiety. His hand froze over the mouse. He had never received emails with such subject lines. Not from friends, not from spammers, from no one. He hesitated for a second. He wanted to close the mail and forget it, as if nothing had happened. But curiosity was stronger. He clicked. "Inside there is only one line. That's what you need to know. I'm sorry." And the attached video. John hovered over the preview image. At first it was blurry, but the next second a face appeared, clearly familiar, painfully, shudderingly familiar. Emily, his wife. The woman with whom he had shared so many years of his life, experienced ups and downs, with whom he had had coffee on Sunday mornings and discussed movies in the evenings. Her lips were kissing two men. One stood behind her, the other in front. Their arms were wrapped around her like ropes, holding her tightly by the waist, along her back, along her shoulders. There was no fear or embarrassment in her face, only detached passion. John's mouth went dry. He felt something heavy begin to build in his chest, squeezing his breath. The hand holding the cup of coffee began to shake, and he almost dropped it. The scalding liquid splashed onto his sleeve, but he didn't even flinch. The screen flickered as if mocking him. His thoughts were confused. When? Where? Why? Was it a hidden camera? Or voluntary? He didn't recognize Emily, not because it wasn't her face, but because he couldn't connect it with the image of the woman he thought was his. He leaned back in his chair, not taking his eyes off the screen. The world seemed to shrink to a point. Everything around him disappeared, leaving only this frame, this scene, this unbearable moment when you learn that the old reality no longer exists. And only one question was beating in my head: what now? A second passed, then another. Each scene tore at his soul more and more. His wife kneeling between two men, her eyes closed in pleasure, her hands sliding clumsily over their bodies. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel the blood pounding in his neck. For a moment, John flinched away from the screen. He looked back at the monitor and saw more. Another man entered the frame, making three of them. They were hugging Emily. Her dress was lifted, revealing her hips and waist. John fell into a silent panic. It can't be. He sat hunched over the table, as if the blow had struck not only his soul, but his body as well. His ears were pounding, the blood was pulsing in his temples, and his mind was trying in vain to comprehend what he had seen. Everything in him demanded an explanation, but there was no explanation. Only a cold screen and a motionless image that became the boundary between two lives, before and after. John's fingers trembled as he reached for the phone. He unlocked it automatically without even looking, the movements becoming automatic, like a man trying to grasp onto something. Finding the Emily contact, he pressed the call button and pressed the receiver to his ear. "Emily," he croaked, his voice rasping as if there was dry, heavy dust in his throat. "Are you home?" But in response, silence. One short attempt to connect, one dull beep, and the call was cut off. He stared at the phone screen as if an explanation was about to emerge. The second call, the same emptiness. No voicemail, no message, not even a busy signal. Just emptiness. The silence sent shivers down his spine. Was this a coincidence? Or did she really not want to talk? Or couldn't? His fingers clenched convulsively. John stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back so far that it crashed against the wall. The air felt thick, heavy. He couldn't breathe, as if there was less oxygen in the room. He began to rush around the office. He went to the window and opened it, but even the cool evening wind did not cool the internal heat. A mixture of rage, pain, humiliation, and anxiety tore him apart from the inside. Why her? The voice in my head kept repeating. When did this start? Who are they? Was it a coincidence? Or was she looking for this? Deliberately? Every question he asked himself caused a new wound, and the worst thing was that he didn't know what he wanted. Truth, recognition, forgiveness. He couldn't even say what he felt more disgust or longing. Because behind all this storm of emotions, there was one thing that still wouldn't let go love. Yes, he still loved her. And this realization turned out to be more frightening than the video. His throat was dry. John swallowed hard and felt his knees buckling as he sank back into the chair. His head was spinning, as if he had been struck. The world around him seemed blurry, sounds muffled, as if he were underwater. His fingers trembled again on the phone. He found the name in his contacts. Mark Carmichael, a photographer Emily had been working with increasingly closely in recent months. John pressed call and pressed the phone to his ear. One beep, two, three. "Pick up the phone," he whispered under his breath, looking into the void. Fourth, then the reset signal. The subscriber does not answer. Damn. John breathed out, gritting his teeth. He repeated the call, and again no answer. His fingers tightened, his knuckles white. He didn't need much, just confirmation. Some information. Who were these people? Who filmed this? Why did this even exist? But in response, there was a deaf, ringing silence. He threw the phone on the table. The device bounced off with a dull thud toward the laptop, the screen of which was still open to that same frozen frame. John looked at it again and felt a cold rush run down his spine. His chest tightened as if someone's hand was slowly, methodically squeezing the air out. I can't get through. Not to Emily. Not to Mark. To anyone. He was left alone with horror, suspicion, and this icy certainty. Everything he knew about his life could be a lie. John sat on the edge of the bed, his heart pounding, his gaze fixed on the small screen of his laptop. What he saw couldn't be true. Warm embraces, smooth fingers over flesh, fiery kisses flashed across the screen, Emily in the passionate embrace of another man. He clutched the coffee cup until it was crushed into pieces, but there was nothing left in his hands except a burning sense of loss. A soft whisper slid helplessly from his lips. This can't be, no. Every muscle in his body screamed its refusal to acknowledge what had happened. John looked at the window. The sun's rays penetrated the tulle, but the inner darkness was so thick that it swallowed up any light. His ears were ringing, his head was filled with an unimaginable noise, as if everything in his life had suddenly turned upside down. Pain squeezed his heart. Emily, his Emily. From a whole year of living together, He knew how she winced at the smell of garlic or laughed until tears at a bad joke. A phrase from the marriage vows flashed, in sorrow and in joy, in wealth and in poverty. The vow of love and fidelity dissolved before the eyes of betrayal. He pressed his finger on the screen, trying to enlarge the picture. Emily's face was hidden in shadow, or a glint of light a vague, and at the same time cloudlessly happy smile on her lips. And even through the pixels he could recognize the eyes so familiar to him once. John felt the floor disappear beneath him. He propped his hand up on the table, trying to stay on his feet. Hot drops were running down his cheeks, tears or sweat. He could no longer tell. It seemed to him as if the whole world around him had stopped in horror before this discovery. No, it's not. What the hell? How could Emily? Only one word was raging in my head: betrayal. His heart was breaking with pain. Just yesterday morning, he was seeing Emily off to work. She was kissing him goodbye, promising to cook his favorite pasta in the evening, talking about her plans for the weekend. And now, does it all seem like a dream? Absurd. But such cold details in the video cannot be explained by a dream. He closed his eyes for a moment, and tears burned his eyelashes, but what had opened them had already flowed through the fingers of life. A boundless emptiness suddenly burst into his mind. John felt treacherously alone, as if the woman into whose abode he had invested love and trust was not his at all. Within seconds, rage erupted from the emptiness in his chest. Disbelief turned to raging anger. His clawed voice echoed through the empty house. "Where are you? Answer me." But Emily was at work, as she had said. In her place, there was only the nightmarish silence of the room and the harsh reality. John grabbed the mug from the table and threw it angrily against the wall. Boiling water spilled across the floor, but his hands could no longer feel the pain. The world itself was burning inside, twisting his guts into knots of hatred. "You betrayed me. Why?" He screamed out loud in his pain, but in response there was only silence. Probably, in a split second, he would no longer feel this anger, only a cold emptiness and the bitterness of powerlessness. John sat in his office, hunched over his desk, as if his very body was trying to shrink, to shield itself from the truth that had just torn his world apart. His laptop screen, still open to the frozen frame of the video, cast a cold, blue light that seemed alien in the cozy room that had smelled of coffee and serenity that morning. The silence was almost tangible, not just the absence of sound, but a heavy, viscous presence of emptiness, saturated with the smell of spilled coffee and the shards of his broken mug that lay against the wall, silent witnesses to his rage. He looked at the screen, but he saw not pixels, but her Emily, his Emily, whose lips touched someone else's lips, whose hands slid over someone else's bodies, whose eyes, closed in ecstasy, were so far from the ones he knew. His fingers still shook around the phone, but he didn't press the call button again. Twice he'd tried to call her, and twice the silence on the line had been louder than any answer. Now he'd decided to wait. Wait for her to come home, until her footsteps sounded in the hallway, until her eyes met his, and then, in that gaze, he'd find either the truth or another lie. He didn't know which was worse. His thoughts were tangled like the wires he'd once helped her untangle, laughing at her clumsiness. Now those memories, their morning coffee talks, her laughter at his stupid jokes, their dreams of a house by the ocean felt less like support than knives, stabbing into his chest with every breath. He stood up, slowly, as if afraid that the movement would destroy the last vestiges of his composure. The floor beneath his feet was cold, despite the warm wood tone Emily loved so much. John went to the shelf where their wedding photograph stood, the two of them against the sunset, her hand in his, her smile so open, so genuine. He ran his finger along the glass of the frame, and the gesture, so familiar, now seemed almost sacrilegious. Who were you at that moment? His mind whispered, but there was no answer. Only silence, broken by the distant sound of the ocean through the half-open window, and the occasional sound of passing cars, their headlights flashing in the twilight like alien lives, indifferent to his pain. John sank into a chair, feeling two fires fighting inside him. The love that still smoldered like coals despite everything, and the rage that flared up like dry brushwood at the mere thought of what he had seen. He had loved her vanilla scent in the morning, her habit of humming under her breath when she thought no one was listening, her warm palms that always found him in the dark. But now that love was poisoned, mixed with pain that squeezed his throat like an invisible hand. He wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but from whom? From her? From Mark Carmichael, whose name now sounded in his head like a poisonous thorn. From the anonymous sender of this letter, who knew his life better than he did. John clenched his fists, feeling his nails digging into his palms, but even that pain could not drown out the one that was tearing him apart from within. John, meanwhile, had gone to the dresser in the living room where they kept their old things boxes of letters, photographs, odds and ends they had collected over the years together. His hands moved almost automatically, as if searching for something that would give him back some lost sense of reality. He opened the top drawer and paused. There, among the postcards and old movie tickets, was a note in her handwriting easy, slightly slanted, with curls on the Y's and G's. John, you are my home. Thank you for always being there. Love, Emily. He remembered when she had written it their first anniversary, the night they had sat on the balcony, drinking wine and laughing at his awkward attempt to dance to her favorite song. He clutched the note in his hand, feeling the paper crumple under his fingers, and the tears he had tried so hard to hold back finally came, hot and scorching. They rolled down his cheeks, leaving a salty trail, and he didn't know if he was crying from love or pain. Maybe both. He sank down onto the couch, still clutching the note, and closed his eyes, trying to remember her voice, her laughter, her warmth. But all he saw were the images from the video, seared into his mind like acid. "I'll wait for you," he whispered into the empty room, not knowing if he was saying it to her or to himself. The ocean roared outside, and its rhythm, so familiar, now seemed mocking. The silence of the house was not just silence, it was an echo of what had already begun to crumble. Night had fallen over Los Angeles like a heavy velvet blanket, enveloping the city in a deep blue, pierced by the flickering of distant lights. The streets, recently buzzing with the bustle of the day, were now silent, and only the occasional car sped past, leaving a trail of light like a comet's trail. Emily stepped out of the taxi, her heels clicking softly on the asphalt, and she froze for a moment, looking at their house dark, silent, as if holding its breath. A slight buzz from the champagne was still singing in her blood, mixed with the euphoria of the evening, but somewhere deep down, under this warm wave, a crack gaped thin, almost imperceptible, but insistent like the memory of John's missed calls. She shook her head, clearing away her anxiety, and stepped toward the door, her light linen dress flapping in the wind like a sail that had lost its direction. It was dark inside the house, with only the faintest bit of moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. Emily expected to hear the usual noises, the clicking of keys if John was working, or the soft snores if he was already asleep. But the silence was different, not the comfortable morning silence, but cold, almost hostile, like the emptiness of an abandoned house. She kicked off her sandals, leaving them by the door, and walked into the living room, her footsteps barely audible on the wooden floor. Her heart pounded a little harder when she spotted a figure in the darkness, John sitting on the couch, his silhouette carved out of the shadows, still as a statue. The laptop on his lap cast a cold blue light that illuminated his face, making his features seem alien, almost unrecognizable. His eyes, usually warm as morning coffee, were now dark, heavy as lead, and the look he directed at her made her freeze in place. "John?" Her voice wavered, a slight hoarseness from the champagne mixed with sudden fear. She took a step forward, but stopped when his eyes didn't soften, and didn't respond with their usual warmth. "You? Why aren't you sleeping? Is something wrong?" He didn't answer. His fingers, resting on the lid of the laptop, slowly tightened, and this gesture, so restrained, was more terrible than any scream. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, as if someone had run an icy finger along her spine. She wanted to smile, to say something light, familiar, but her lips froze, and in her chest there was a growing feeling as if she was standing on the edge of an abyss. John silently turned the laptop towards her, and the screen, like a merciless judge, showed her the truth. "We are not afraid to tell the truth," even when it hurts. We are here to expose betrayal, lies, and double standards. If you don't want to live in illusions, either like it, and even better subscribe to always be on the side of justice. Together, we are a force that speaks loudly. Video. Her face, familiar but alien, eyes closed, half smiling, full of passion. Vince's hands on her waist, Jason's lips on her neck, her own fingers sliding over their bodies. The sound was muffled, but she could hear it, her breathing, their whispers, the soft laughter that had seemed like a game, a moment of freedom, but now felt like betrayal. Emily felt the blood drain from her face, her skin cool, almost marbled. She opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. "John," she began, her voice thin, almost childish, but he interrupted her, not raising his tone, but with such force that she flinched. "What is it, Emily?" His voice was low, like distant thunder, but there was no fury in it, only cold, sharp as a blade. "Explain it to me, now. What the hell is this?" She took a step back, her hands rising involuntarily to her chest, as if in defense. Her mind raced, trying to find a foothold, but all she could see were his eyes, devoid of any of the John who had called her a ray of light that morning. She wanted to tell him that this was a mistake, that it wasn't what it seemed, but her words tangled like the threads in an old sweater they had once unraveled together, laughing. I don't know how it happened," she managed, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. "I was drunk, John. They could have slipped me something. I don't remember. It's happening like that. It wasn't me, it wasn't." "Not you?" He stood up abruptly, and the laptop fell onto the couch with a thud. His face, illuminated by the moonlight, was distorted with pain, but his voice remained calm, almost frighteningly calm. "Not you, Emily. It's your face, your hands, your fucking lips that kissed those bastards. Are you telling me that someone forced you? Put something in your drink? Do you seriously expect me to believe that nonsense?" Her eyes widened, tears already burning at the corners, but she still tried to hold herself together, as if she could pick up the pieces of this moment. "John, please, listen." Her voice broke, becoming higher, almost pleading. "I didn't mean to, I didn't think. It was just the evening, I don't know how it happened. I wasn't myself, Out of your mind." He took a step toward her, his shadow long and sharp on the floor, like a boundary between them. "You look so fucking cool in that video, Emily. You're smiling, you're enjoying it, damn it. Do you think I'm blind? Do you think I can't see how you let those scumbags touch you like I'm nothing to you?" The tears finally came, hot and uncontrollable, and she pressed her palms to her face, trying to hide from his words, from his gaze, from the truth that now stood between them like a wall. "It's not true," she cried, her voice shaking, but there was a desperate attempt to defend herself in it. "I didn't mean to hurt you, John. I love you, you know that. It was a mistake. I couldn't control myself. Please believe me." "Trust you," he laughed, but it was bitter, like poison, and it cut her harder than his scream. "Do you even realize what you've done? You've torn everything we had, Emily. Everything I built, everything I—" He trailed off, his voice breaking, and for a moment there was not anger in his eyes, but pain, so deep that she felt her own heart squeeze. "I looked at you this morning, and I thought you were my everything. And now I don't know who the hell you are." She took a step toward him, her hands shaking as she tried to touch his shoulder, but he flinched as if from fire. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice quiet, but with such power that she froze. "Don't you dare. Do you think your tears will change anything? Do you think I'll forget how you knelt before those bastards? Do you even know what that looks like?" "John, I don't." She choked, her voice drowning in sobs. "I don't know who took this. I didn't ask for this. I, I was drunk. I didn't think it was. I didn't want you to see it." "I did," he snapped, his eyes narrowing to nothing but a cold, almost frightening determination. "And you know what the worst part is? I still love you, Emily. And that's the fucking worst part, because I don't know how to live with it." She froze, her breath hitched, and tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving wet tracks that glittered in the moonlight. She wanted to rush to him, to embrace him, to beg, but his words, I still love you were both salvation and a sentence. She opened her mouth, but no words came out, only a convulsive sob escaped from her chest. Who are they? He asked suddenly, his voice quieter, but with a new, dangerous edge to it. Those bastards in the video. Who are they, Emily? Mark? His buddies? Or some random scumbag you picked up at your goddamn party? She hesitated, her mind racing, trying to remember faces, names, moments. It was the people from the party, John. Vince, Jason, I don't know how it came to. I didn't think that. You didn't think? He laughed again, and the sound was like a whip crack. You didn't think when you undressed in front of them, when you let them grope you, when you kissed them like I was nothing? Did you ever think about me, Emily? About me waiting for you at home, believing in you like an idiot? I was thinking about you, she cried, her voice breaking into a desperate scream. I'm always thinking about you. It was a mistake, John, I swear. I didn't mean for this to happen. They could have slipped me something. I don't remember everything. Stop it, he barked, the first cry he'd heard in the entire conversation echoing off the walls. Stop lying, Emily. You expect me to believe that drugged bullshit? You look like you were enjoying it in that video. You were happy, damn it, and don't you dare say it wasn't you, because I know you. I know every smile you give, every look you give, and I saw the way you looked at them. She fell to her knees, her dress crumpled like her own soul, and she covered her face with her hands, sobbing as if everything inside her was being torn apart. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm sorry, John. I didn't mean to. I don't know how to fix this. Fix it? He looked down at her, his figure huge, almost menacing, in the darkness. You think it can be fixed? You broke everything, Emily. Everything we had. Our lives, our love, our... He trailed off, his voice breaking, and for a moment it seemed like he, too, was about to break. But he straightened, clenched his jaw, and added, I don't know who you are anymore, and I don't know if I want to know. He turned and walked toward the bedroom stairs, his steps heavy, as if he carried the weight of their shattered world on his shoulders. Emily reached out as if she could stop him, but her fingers only caught air. John, please, she whispered, but he didn't turn around. The bedroom door closed behind him with a soft click, louder than any scream. She was alone in the living room, kneeling among shadows that seemed alive, mocking. Tears streamed down her face, falling to the floor, and she made no attempt to stop them. Her body was racked with sobs so strong that she felt like she would fall apart. She looked at the laptop, still lying on the couch, its screen now black, but the images from the video still burned in her mind like a brand. She didn't remember everything. The evening was a blur, like a painting that had been doused with water, but she knew she couldn't deny the truth. She had let it happen, and now that truth stood between her and John, like a wall that couldn't be breached. Emily crawled toward the couch, her fingers shaking as she reached for her laptop, but stopped. She couldn't watch it again. She didn't want to. Instead, her gaze fell on the shards of the mug that still lay against the wall. The best is yet to come. The inscription that had once seemed like a promise of their future was now just a mockery. She closed her eyes, trying to remember that morning, his warm voice, his hand on her shoulder, his words about how beautiful she was. But all she saw were his eyes, full of pain and contempt, and his words that cut her like knives. She pressed her forehead against the couch, her sobs growing quieter but no less wrenching. Her mind raced between fear, guilt, and despair. She wanted to explain, she wanted to beg, she wanted to turn back time, but she knew it was impossible. John had gone to bed, leaving her alone, and the night, so warm and full of life just hours ago, was now as cold as the grave of their marriage. Emily didn't know how much time had passed, minutes, hours. But she was still sitting on the floor, her dress wet with tears, her hair plastered to her cheeks. Outside, Los Angeles slept, indifferent to her pain, and only the sound of the ocean, distant and rhythmic, reminded her that the world was still going on, even as her own was crumbling. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold on to the warmth that had left her body, and whispered into the void, I'm sorry, John, I'm sorry. But there was no answer. Only silence, cold and merciless, like a mirror in which she was now afraid to see her reflection. Morning burst into the house like an uninvited guest, cruelly tearing apart the darkness in which Emily had spent the rest of the night. The light that poured through the curtains was not the soft, pink glow she loved, but harsh, almost blinding, as if the sun had decided to expose all her faults. She lay on the sofa, still in the same linen dress, which was now wrinkled, soaked in the smell of tears and champagne. Her eyes, puffy from sobbing, ached, and her throat was dry, as if she had swallowed sand. The silence in the house was not just silence, it was an emptiness that echoed with John's words, his cold gaze, his footsteps retreating to the bedroom. Emily rose slowly, her movements sluggish, like a puppet whose strings had snapped. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stop herself from shaking, but the cold that settled in her chest was stronger than the morning sun. She glanced at the coffee table, hoping to see something familiar, the cup John always left half empty, or his notebook of notes. Instead, her gaze fell on a piece of paper, folded in half, lying on the edge of the table like a sentence awaiting execution. Her heart sank, and she paused, hesitating to touch it. The paper was white, too clean for this morning, and its simplicity was threatening. Emily reached out, her fingers shaking like leaves in the wind, and unfolded the paper. John's handwriting, even but with sharp, almost violent lines, cut her like a knife. Emily, I don't know who you are now, but I know that I don't need a woman of easy virtue who betrays everything we had. I'm filing for divorce. Don't try to find me. You ruined everything. Goodbye. The words hit her like a slap, each one slicing into her mind, leaving a raw wound. Woman of easy virtue. The word, so harsh, so foreign, was more than an insult. It was a label that John, her John, had placed on her. She reread the note, her eyes darting over the lines as if they could find something different in them, but each word was as constant as a sentence. Emily felt her knees buckle, and she sank to the floor, clutching the note in her hands as if she could crush it, destroy it, erase this moment from existence. The tears that had seemed to have dried up during the night came again, hot and uncontrollable, falling onto the paper and smearing the ink. No, 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 she whispered, her voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. John, you can't do this. She lunged for the phone on the couch, her fingers shaking as she dialed his number. The beeps came one after another, long and monotonous, like hammer blows. 1, 2, 3. No answer. She pressed redial, her breath coming in short gasps, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst her chest. More beeps, more silence. Emily opened her messenger, but there was a new wound waiting for her. Her messages weren't being delivered. He had blocked her. Everywhere. On her phone, in messengers, on social media. She scrolled through their chats, desperately searching for anything his latest message, his usual, I love you, but all she saw were gray icons telling her he had cut her off from his life. Panic washed over her like a wave washing over the shore. She gasped, her fingers clutching the phone as if it were the last thread connecting her to John. This had not been part of her script. She had thought she could explain, that she could beg, that he would forgive her eventually. She had counted on control, that her tears, her words, her love could bring him back. But now, with that note in her hands, she realized she had lost everything. John, her rock, her home, her morning light, was now farther away than the stars she had seen on the roof yesterday. Emily jumped up, her bare feet getting caught in the hem of her dress and almost falling. She darted to the bedroom door and threw it open, but the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, as if he had never slept in it. His scent, a mix of coffee and woodsy cologne, still lingered in the air, but he was gone. She opened the closet, hoping to find his clothes, but several hangers were empty. His favorite jacket, the one he had worn on the beach with her, was gone. Emily felt her legs give way beneath her, and she sank to the edge of the bed, clutching the note that now seemed to her the only proof that John had ever existed. Please come back, she whispered into the void, but her voice was lost in the silence. She dialed his number again, but the dial tone was as lifeless as her hope. Emily threw the phone on the bed and covered her face with her hands, her sobs quiet but so deep that they seemed to tear her apart from the inside. She didn't know how to fix this. She didn't know how to live with this. Everything she had, their home, their memories, their love, was now crumbling like sand in her palms. Meanwhile, John sat in his lawyer's office, a sterile white room where the smell of leather chairs and paper mingled with the cold scent of air conditioning. The morning sun shone through the blinds, casting harsh stripes across the desk where Martin Klein, a lawyer with a reputation for never losing a case, sat. His face, with its deep lines and steely eyes, was the picture of quiet confidence, but John felt nothing but emptiness. He sat across from him, his fingers clutching a folder of documents he had collected overnight: email transcripts, screenshots, a video he had copied onto a flash drive as poisonous evidence. His gaze was fixed on the floor, but he didn't see the carpet. He saw her face, her smile, her betrayal. "Mr. Walker," Martin began, his voice level and professional, but with a hint of sympathy that didn't irritate, but rather underscored the gravity of the situation. "I've reviewed the materials you provided. Videos, correspondence, location data, financial statements. We have everything we need to file a divorce suit on your terms. Given the circumstances, we can insist on a full division of property in your favor, taking into account moral damages. I also recommend including a demand to deprive her of her right to the house and compensation for your marriage and housing expenses." John nodded, his face a mask. He had been awake all night, his eyes red but dry, the tears gone, only cold determination left. He had left the house at dawn, leaving a note that had been written in a fit of rage, but now, sitting here, he did not regret it. Every word on that note had been true, his truth, ripped from the heart she had broken. He knew she would try to call, try to explain, but he didn't want her words. Not now. He had blocked her everywhere, on his phone, on messengers, on social media, cutting her off from himself like a surgeon cutting away infected tissue. "I want it to be quick," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "I don't want to see her. I don't want to hear her. I want her out of my life." Martin nodded, making a note on his pad. "I understand. We can file within 48 hours. Given the video and your financial investment in the marriage, the house, the accounts, the joint assets, we have a strong position. The court will likely consider emotional damages, especially with that kind of evidence. Are you sure you want to go all the way? It's going to be a tough process." John looked up, his eyes dark as a storm. "I'm sure. She ruined everything. I don't want her to have anything left of our lives." Martin leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the table as if weighing each word. "Okay, I'll prepare the suit today. We'll include a demand for full compensation, the house you bought, the bills you paid, and emotional distress. The video," he paused, his gaze softening slightly. "It strengthens our position greatly. But I must warn you, these cases rarely go quietly. She may try to contest it and hire her own lawyer. Are you prepared for that?" John clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, but he didn't even feel the pain. "Let him try. I won't back down. She made her choice, and now I'm making mine." Martin nodded, his expression professional and unflappable again. "Then let's get started. I'll draw up the paperwork and send it to you for review by this evening. If everything is in order, we'll file the lawsuit tomorrow morning. Do you want me to notify her lawyer if one becomes available?" "No," John snapped. "Let her find out for herself. I don't want to talk to her. Ever." He stood up, his movements abrupt, as if he wanted to physically block out everything connected with Emily. The folder of documents remained on the table, its black cover a symbol of the end of their marriage, of their dreams, of their mourning. John walked out of the office without looking back, and the sunlight in his eyes was as sharp as his pain. He got into the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel, and for a moment he closed his eyes, trying to remember her face, not the one on the video, but the one he saw every morning, her smile, her warm gaze. But all he saw were shadows, strange hands, her closed eyes, full of betrayal. The next morning came into Emily's house like a cold wind that seeps through the cracks and freezes everything alive. She woke up on the living room floor, still clutching John's crumpled note, her body aching from the awkward position, her eyes puffy from crying, stinging from the light pouring through the curtains. The silence in the house wasn't just the absence of sound, it was deathly, as if the walls knew of her shame and had turned away from her. Emily rose slowly, her movements sluggish, like someone who had lost not only her footing, but also herself. She glanced at her phone lying on the couch, and her heart sank dozens of notifications, missed calls, messages, but not one from John. His absence was like a wound that wouldn't heal, only deepening with every breath. She opened her phone, her fingers shaking, and the first thing she saw was an email from her agent, Laura, with the subject line, "Urgent Conversation." Emily frowned, her mind still clouded with pain and panic, but something about the subject line made her freeze. She clicked, and the words, written in a dry, professional tone, hit her like a hammer. "Emily, we have received materials that jeopardize your reputation and our contracts. We need to discuss your removal from current projects immediately. Call me within the hour. Laura." Emily felt the blood drain from her face, her skin turning cool, almost marble-like. Stuff. What stuff? She opened her messaging apps, and her gaze caught on a message from a friend, Sarah, with whom she hadn't spoken in months. "Emily, what is this video? What's going on? Call me." Another one from her co-star. "Are you okay? Is this true?" Her fingers trembled even more as she opened her inbox and saw an email from a PR manager for a brand she'd worked with for the past 6 months. The subject line, "Termination of cooperation." Emily didn't want to read it, but her eyes were already skimming the lines, each word like a blow. "Dear Miss Walker, due to the receipt of compromising materials that contradict our brand values, we are forced to terminate your contract immediately. Please refrain from any public comments until the internal investigation is completed. Sincerely, Jennifer Crow, PR Department." Emily gasped, her breath coming in short gasps as if someone were squeezing her throat. The video. That video. But how? Who? She lunged for her laptop, still lying on the couch, its screen as black as her future. She opened it, her fingers tangling, and searched through email, through instant messaging, through social media. And then she saw it, a short, censored clip, her face blurred but still recognizable, her body in Vince and Jason's arms, her movements full of passion that now felt like a curse rather than a release. The video had been sent anonymously, without a caption, without an explanation, but it had reached everyone: her agent, her coworkers, her friends, and, worst of all, her parents. She opened the text from her mother, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the phone. "Emily, what is this? Why are we being sent this? Call us now." Emily felt her stomach clench, and she ran for the bathroom, barely making it to the sink before she threw up. She stood there, leaning against the cold tiles, her body racked with spasms, her mind screaming John. It could only be him. His note, his blocking, his rage, all pointed to him. He hadn't just left, he had chosen to destroy her, to rip her from the world she had worked so hard to build. Emily walked back into the living room, her legs wobbly, and collapsed onto the couch, clutching her phone as if it could give her answers. She tried calling John, over and over, but the dial tone was as lifeless as her hope. She texted him, her fingers flying across the screen, but the messages were not delivered. He was out of reach, a ghost who had left only destruction in his wake. Emily opened her contacts, found Mark Carmichael's number, and pressed call. One ring, two, three. No answer. She tried again, but the result was the same. Mark, the man who had looked at her with admiration yesterday, who had called her to the roof, was now silent, as if he had never existed. She dialed Vince, her fingers shaking, but his number was unavailable. Jason, Chris, everyone who had been with her at that damn party were gone, like shadows dissolving into the morning light. Emily felt panic wash over her, like a wave washing over a shore. She was alone against a world that no longer saw her as a model, a wife, a daughter, but as the woman in that video, the woman whose life was now on display for all to see. Her phone rang, and she jumped, hoping it was John. But it was Laura, her agent. Emily answered, her voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. Laura, Emily, Laura's voice was cold as steel, without a trace of the warmth that had filled their earlier conversations. I don't know what happened, but it's a disaster. The brand has pulled you from all shoots. They've terminated your contract, and other partners are already calling, demanding an explanation. Someone sent the video to your colleagues, to clients, even to your family. This, this is the end, Emily. I can't get you out of this. Laura, please, Emily gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks and onto her dress, which now felt as dirty as her reputation. It's not what it looks like. I was drunk. There might have been something slipped into my drink. I didn't. That's enough, Laura said. I don't want to hear any excuses. Do you understand what this means? Your career is ruined. No one will work with a model whose name is now associated with this. I advise you to hire a lawyer and stay off social media. Goodbye, Emily. The connection went dead, and Emily froze, her hand still clutching her phone, as if it could give her back Laura, her career, her life. She opened her social media, despite the warning, and her heart sank. Her profile was littered with comments from strangers, from coworkers, from people she barely knew. Shame. How could you? You ruined your family. Some posted screenshots of the video, others shared rumors that grew like weeds. Emily closed the app, her breathing ragged, as if she were drowning. She hadn't just been removed from the set, she had been erased from the world that had applauded her just yesterday. She rushed to her laptop, opened her email, and started to write to her parents, to her friend, to Laura, but her fingers froze. What would she say? That it was a mistake? That she didn't remember? No one would believe it. She didn't believe it herself. Emily closed the laptop and collapsed on the floor, her sobs so deep they felt like they were turning her inside out. She wanted to scream, she wanted to run, she wanted to disappear, but all she could do was sit there, in a house that wasn't her home anymore, and watch her life crumble away like sand she couldn't hold on to. Meanwhile, John sat in his office, his eyes fixed on his computer screen, but he didn't see the numbers and graphs that usually occupied his thoughts. His fingers still remembered sending that video anonymously through a secure service that left no trace. He'd done it the night after he'd written the note, after his rage and pain had coalesced into one desire, for her to feel what it was like to lose everything. He'd sent the video to the PR people at the brand she worked for, to her agent, to her parents, even to her friend Sarah, whose number he'd found in an old text message. He didn't want this to be a scam. He wanted her to pay for every moment he'd seen on that screen, for every smile she'd made, for every touch she'd made with those men. His lawyer, Martin, had already announced that the papers had been filed. The lawsuit was as tough as John wanted, a full division of the property in his favor, Emily's right to the house, compensation for all the years of marriage, including emotional damages. The video he had provided was a trump card that made their position almost unbeatable. But even this victory brought no relief. John felt empty, like a shell from which all life had been taken. He had not done this out of revenge, or perhaps precisely because of it, he no longer knew. He had done it because he could not do otherwise, because her betrayal was like a poison that had poisoned not only their marriage, but himself as well. He opened the desk drawer and pulled out the photograph, the one from the beach, laughing, her hair blowing in the wind and his hand on her shoulder. He looked at it, and his throat tightened. He still loved her, and that was the worst part. He hated himself for it, for the fact that even now, after everything, he couldn't just erase her from his heart. John clutched the photograph, its edges crumpling under his fingers, and he threw it back into the drawer, slamming it shut so hard the desk shook. His phone rang, and he glanced at the screen. Martin. John answered, his voice flat, as if he didn't feel anything. Yes. The paperwork has been filed, Martin said, his tone businesslike, but with a hint of satisfaction. The court will schedule a hearing within the week. I also received word that she has been dropped from the shoot. The brand has terminated her contract, and her agent appears to have dropped her. The video did its job. John nodded, though Martin couldn't see him. Okay, he said, his voice empty as an echo in an abandoned house. Go on. He hung up and stood up, going to the window. Los Angeles was shining in the sun, its skyscrapers reflecting the light like mirrors, but to John, the city was now a stranger. He had done what he wanted. He had destroyed her world, just as she had destroyed his. But somehow, that didn't bring him peace. He closed his eyes, and her face appeared before him again, not the one on the video, but the one he saw every morning, her warm gaze, her smile. And in that moment, he realized that his revenge had not freed him. It had only bound him to her even more tightly. The courtroom was cold, despite the soft light that poured through the tall windows, and the air seemed sterile, heavy with the scent of polished wood and old paper. The rows of benches, arranged with geometric precision, were almost empty, with only a few people, lawyers, a clerk, the occasional spectator sitting at a distance, their presence only serving to emphasize the loneliness of the two figures standing on opposite sides of an invisible chasm. John entered the room first, his steps firm, almost mechanical, as if he had rehearsed this moment 100 times. His dark suit, pressed to perfection, emphasized his determination, but beneath the armor there was an emptiness, not rage, not pain, but a cold, scorched silence that remained in the wake of all he had lost. He did not look back, did not seek her with his eyes, his gaze fixed ahead on the judge's table, where their end would soon be decided. Emily walked in a few minutes later, her steps unsteady, like someone walking on thin ice. Her face, once radiant in the morning light of their bedroom, was now pale, almost translucent, with dark circles under her eyes that betrayed the sleepless nights and tears that had become her only companion. Her dress, a simple gray, hung on her as if on a coat rack, emphasizing how thin she had become in these weeks. She tried to hold her back straight, but her shoulders were shaking, and the hands clutching her bag were so tense that her knuckles were white. She looked at John, searching for the slightest hint of the man who had once called her his light. But his profile was stony, motionless as a statue, and he did not turn to face her. This refusal, this silence, was more terrible than any words he could have spoken. The judge, an older woman with tired eyes and a stern face, walked into the courtroom, and everyone stood, their movements synchronized, like a ritual devoid of emotion. Emily felt her heart tighten as she sank into her seat. Her lawyer, a young man in a cheap suit she had hired at the last minute, looking uncertain, his file thin, almost pathetic compared to the thick stack of papers held by John's lawyer, Martin Klein. Martin stood, his voice even but authoritative, as if he were not simply speaking but passing judgment. "Your Honor," he began, his tone professional, but with a hint of disdain that cut Emily like a blade. "We represent Mr. John Walker in the matter of divorce from Miss Emily Walker. The grounds for divorce are proven adultery, resulting in emotional distress and a complete breakdown of the trust necessary to maintain the marriage. We have irrefutable evidence, video footage, correspondence, and third-party testimony that Miss Walker's conduct was incompatible with her duties as a wife." Emily felt her cheeks heat up despite the chill of the courtroom. The word betrayal hung in the air like poison, and she looked down, unable to bear the weight of their gazes, the judges, the clerks, even her own lawyer, who was nervously leafing through papers. She wanted to scream, to explain that this was a mistake, that she wasn't herself, but her voice died in her throat, choked by shame and fear. She knew that the video that John had sent out like the plague, was their trump card, and she had no defense against it. Martin continued, his words as precise as hammer blows. "Mr. Walker has invested heavily in their life together, the house, the car, the bills that he pays exclusively. He has also suffered emotional distress caused by the public humiliation and loss of trust. We are seeking a full division of the assets in Mr. Walker's favor, including the house, the car, and the joint accounts, as well as compensation for emotional distress and marital expenses. Miss Walker has demonstrated by her actions that she has no right to these assets. Moreover, her behavior makes it impossible to restore trust, eliminating any chance of reconciliation." John sat still, his hands clasped together on the table, so tightly that the veins stood out beneath his skin. He did not look at Emily, his eyes were fixed on the judge, but there was no triumph or relief in them, only emptiness, as if he had already buried their past, and was here only to hammer nails into the coffin. Emily, sitting opposite him, felt his detachment like physical pain, and her fingers involuntarily reached for the edge of the table, as if they could keep her from falling into the abyss. Her lawyer, David, stood up, his voice hesitant, almost apologetic. "Your Honor," he began, clearing his throat, "my client, Miss Walker, admits responsibility for the incident, but asks that the circumstances be taken into account. She claims that she was under the influence of alcohol and possibly other substances, which contributed to her behavior. She deeply regrets what happened and asks the court to be lenient in dividing the property, given her contribution to their life together and her current financial situation." Emily pressed her lips together, her eyes filling with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She knew her lawyer was doing his best, but his words sounded weak, almost ridiculous against Martin's clear, relentless argument. The judge looked at her, her eyes neither judgmental nor sympathetic, just tired, as if she'd seen 100 stories like this. "Do you have anything to add, Miss Walker?" she asked, her voice as dry as autumn leaves. Emily stood up, her legs shaking, and she grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. She began, her voice hoarse, barely audible. "I didn't mean to do this. I love John. I made a mistake, but I didn't mean to ruin our lives. Please, I lost everything. Don't take what's left of me." Her words hung in the air, weak as smoke, and she looked at John, begging him to meet her gaze for just a second. But he didn't turn. His face was as still as granite, and that silence, that refusal, was worse than any sentence. Emily sank into a chair, her shoulders slumped, and she covered her face with her hands, feeling the tears finally come, hot and useless. The judge made a note in her papers, her pen moving with indifferent precision across the page. "Based on the evidence presented," she began, her voice flat and emotionless, "the court finds that Miss Walker has committed adultery, which is sufficient grounds for dissolution of the marriage. Taking into account Mr. Walker's financial contributions, as well as the moral damages documented in the case file, the court orders the division of property in favor of the plaintiff. The house, car, and joint accounts are to be the sole property of Mr. Walker. Compensation for moral damages and expenses of the marriage are also awarded to the plaintiff. The judgment is final." Emily felt the floor shift beneath her even as she sat. Every word the judge said was like a blow, knocking the last of the air out of her. She had lost everything: the house where they had shared coffee in the morning, the car they had driven to the beach, the bills that had been their future together. But worst of all, she had lost John, not just as a husband, but as the man who had once looked at her with love. He was a stranger now, and that strangeness was her punishment. Martin gathered up the papers, his face professionally satisfied, but John didn't move. He stood up only when the judge left the courtroom, his movements mechanical, like a man doing his duty. He didn't look at Emily, didn't say a word, simply handed the file to Martin and headed for the exit, his footsteps echoing in the empty courtroom. Emily wanted to shout, to call him, but her voice died in her throat, choked by the sobs she could no longer hold back. She sat there, her lawyer talking, but his words were just background, like the sound of rain outside the window. Emily looked at the empty space where John had been and felt her world finally crumble. She was broken not just without property, without a career, without a home, but without a foundation, without what made her who she was. The video John had sent had destroyed her reputation, but this court, this cold room, had destroyed her soul. When she finally walked out of the courthouse, the sun was in her eyes, but it didn't warm her. Los Angeles was as bright as ever, its skyscrapers reflecting the light like mirrors, but to Emily, the city was foreign now. She stood on the steps, her bag slung over her shoulder like the only thing she had left. The wind ruffled her hair, and she closed her eyes, trying to remember their morning, his warm voice, his hand on her shoulder, his words about how beautiful she was. But all she saw was his back as he walked out of the courtroom, and the emptiness that was now her life. Los Angeles was left behind, like a faded photograph that John had folded up and filed away. He moved to a small coastal town an hour outside the metropolis, where the pace of life was slower and the ocean was not a backdrop, but the main character of each day. His new home was modest, a one-story cottage with sun-bleached shingles and a deck overlooking the beach. The morning light that filtered through the wooden blinds was no longer a reminder of the past. It was simply light, pure and indifferent, promising a new day. John had chosen this place for a reason. There was no bustle, no familiar faces, no echo of the life he had left behind in a court case, in a note, in a video he had sent out. There was only him, the ocean, and a chance to start over. The first weeks after the divorce were like walking on broken glass. The pain hadn't gone away, it just lurked there, like a shadow, ready to overtake him at any moment. But John was determined not to let it win. Emily's betrayal, her smile in that video, her hands on other people's bodies, all of it could have destroyed him, but he hadn't let it. Instead of wallowing in bitterness or seeking oblivion in casual relationships, he had chosen a different path, a path toward himself. He didn't seek solace in another woman. He didn't need a replacement for Emily, someone to fill the void. The void, he realized, was a part of him, and it needed to be rebuilt, not filled. Every morning began the same way. At dawn, when the sky was still gray and pink and the air smelled of salt and damp grass, John would go for a run. His sneakers would leave deep tracks in the damp sand, and his breath would match the rhythm of the waves crashing on the shore. He would run until his lungs burned, until his thoughts grew quiet, until the pain dissolved into physical exertion. Sport became his anchor, not just a way to pass the time, but a way to remind himself that his body, his will, his life were still his. He joined a local gym, where the rusty barbells and worn mats smelled of sweat and honesty. There he would lift weights, feeling his muscles tense, the blood pulsing in his veins, each drop of sweat proof that he was stronger than he thought. The job had changed too. John had left his old position in Los Angeles, where every office corridor reminded him of the past, of Emily's calls, her messages, of how he waited for her after filming. Now he was consulting remotely, working on financial projects for small startups. His new office was the terrace of a cottage, where his laptop stood next to a cup of black coffee, and instead of the noise of the city, he heard the cries of seagulls. Work was not just a way to earn money, it became his way of building, creating, regaining a sense of control. He immersed himself in numbers, graphs, forecasts, finding in their logic the order that his soul so lacked. Each completed project, each satisfied client was a small victory, a brick in the foundation of a new life. But John's rebirth was not limited to his body and his work. He realized that Emily's betrayal had done more than destroy their marriage. It had exposed his own weaknesses, his dependence on her light, his habit of living for their we and forgetting about the I. He began to read not light novels, buy books on philosophy, psychology, self-help. Stoicism became his compass. The idea that you cannot control others, but you can control your reactions, became for him not just a theory, but a practice. He wrote down his thoughts in a notebook, sitting on the terrace as the sunset painted the sky crimson. Pain is not an enemy, he wrote, it is a teacher. It shows you where you are weak and gives you a chance to become stronger. These words, simple but heavy, became his mantra. John also took up meditation. Every morning, after his run, he would sit cross-legged on the edge of the terrace and listen to the ocean, letting his breathing sync with its rhythm. This wasn't an attempt to forget Emily or numb the pain, it was a way to embrace it. He would close his eyes and see her face, her smile, her betrayal, but instead of cringing with rage, he would breathe deeply, letting the images wash over him like waves that don't linger on the shore. Meditation taught him to let go, not to forgive, not to forget, but simply not to hold on to the poison that might poison his future. His life had become simpler, but not empty. He cooked for himself simple meals like fried fish and vegetables, savoring the process, the smell of the herbs, the sizzle of the oil in the pan. He walked along the beach, collecting smooth stones that he would pile on the windowsill, a reminder that even the hardest things were shaped by time and water. He took up the habit of writing letters, not to Emily, not to anyone in particular, but to himself, pouring out onto paper all the things he couldn't say out loud. He didn't reread the letters, but burned them in the backyard, watching the flames consume the words, freeing him of their weight. The neighbors, few and far between, noticed the change. Old Bill, who lived in the cottage next door, would sometimes drop in with a bottle of beer to talk about fishing or the weather. He didn't ask about John's past, but once, looking at the sunset, he said, "You look like a man who's been through a storm and learned to stand up straight." John smiled without answering, but the words sank into his soul. He wasn't the old John, the one who'd lost himself in love for Emily, who'd built his life around her. He was new, tempered, like steel that's been through fire. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evenings, when the ocean whispered its ancient stories, John allowed himself to think of her. Not with hatred, not with longing, but with cold clarity. He didn't regret the video he'd sent, the trial, the divorce. It had been his way of surviving, his way of standing up for himself. But he also knew that revenge hadn't healed him. It had only given him time to begin healing himself. Emily was part of his past, but not his future. His future was here in the dawn runs, in the books he'd read, in the work that brought meaning, in the stones on the windowsill, in the breathing he was learning to control. One day, sitting on the terrace with a cup of coffee, John saw a seagull, beating against the wind, suddenly catch the current and soar upward, light and free. As he watched it, something new stirred in his chest, not joy, not relief, but a quiet confidence. Emily's betrayal had not destroyed him. It had broken him, but in those cracks he had found the strength to put himself back together, piece by piece, day by day. He was not just a survivor, he was a man learning to live again, and this life, simple and honest, was his victory. 2 months had slipped by like sand slipping through your fingers, but for Emily, every day felt like a year, scorched by loneliness and shame. Los Angeles, once her stage, her triumph, had become a ghost town, where every corner, every storefront, every glint of sunlight on a skyscraper's glass reminded her of what she had lost. Her career had been erased like a drawing in the sand washed away by a wave. Her friends, her connections, her reputation all had dissolved the very night she had allowed herself to be someone else. Her parents, whose calls she now avoided, looked at her with pain and disappointment, their voices, in the rare conversations they had had, full of tired pity. Emily lived in a tiny rented apartment on the outskirts, where the smell of damp and cheap detergent permeated everything: her clothes, her skin, her thoughts. She was a shadow of her former self. Her face, once radiant on billboards, was now pale, with deep shadows under her eyes, and her hair, which she had once styled with easy carelessness, hung in dull strands. But worst of all, there was an emptiness inside, not just the absence of John, but the absence of herself, the woman who had once believed in her strength, her love, her future. She found him by chance, or maybe not so much by chance. Emily had spent weeks calling old acquaintances, scrolling through social media, chasing any clue that might lead to him. She didn't know why she needed to, didn't know what she would say, but the thought of John, his last look in court, his note, his silence, was like a splinter she couldn't pull out. She needed to see him, just once, to say what was burning inside her, to maybe find some sliver of forgiveness not from him, but from herself. And then, 2 months later, she found out he lived in a small beach town an hour outside of Los Angeles. She didn't think twice. She got into the old car she'd borrowed from a neighbor and drove off, her hands shaking on the wheel, her heart pounding as if it knew this was her last chance. The town greeted her with silence, broken only by the cries of seagulls and the whisper of the waves. The streets were narrow, paved with cracked asphalt, and the houses, faded by the sun, seemed as tired as she was. Emily stopped at the cottage that had been described to her modest, with peeling paint and a terrace where the wind played with the curtains. She got out of the car, her legs weak, and the salt-laden air seemed too thick to breathe. She stood at the gate, looking at the house, and for a moment she thought she might turn and walk away, leaving everything as it was. But her hand had already pushed the gate open, and she stepped forward, her footsteps barely audible on the sandy path. John was on the terrace, sitting in a wooden chair, a book in his hands. His skin was slightly darkened by the sun, his hair was a little longer than she remembered, and there was something new in his posture, not tension, not pain, but a quiet confidence, as if he had found himself in this place, in this solitude. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and their eyes met. Emily froze, her breath caught. her heart clenching so hard she almost felt physical pain. His face didn't change, no anger, no surprise, just a hint of recognition, as if he were looking at someone who was part of another life. "John," her voice was hoarse, almost alien, and she took a step forward, her hands clenched into fists involuntarily to stop the shaking. I found you." He closed the book, slowly, his movements deliberate, as if he didn't want to waste any extra energy. He didn't stand up, didn't smile, didn't turn away, he just looked at her, his eyes as deep as the ocean behind him, but there was no warmth or cold in them, only clarity. Emily felt her throat tighten, and the tears she had tried so hard to hold back were already burning the corners of her eyes. "I'm sorry," she breathed, her voice breaking as she stepped closer, her fingers fiddling with the hem of the old sweater that hung on her like someone else's skin. "John, I didn't know what I was losing. I didn't realize what I was doing until I lost everything. I didn't mean for it to be this way. I love you. I always have." The words came out of her like water from a cracked dam, chaotic, desperate, full of the pain she had carried inside her for 2 months. She looked at him, begging him with her eyes to answer, to scream, to at least show that her words meant something. But John was silent, his gaze as still as the rock he would later stand on. He placed the book on the table, his fingers lightly touching its cover, and only then did he speak, his voice quiet but firm, like the surf that would not stop. "You've lost someone who would never betray you," he said, and there was no malice in his words, no revenge, only a calm, almost frightening truth. "And that's enough." Emily gasped, her tears streaming down, hot and uncontrollable, onto the sand at her feet. She wanted to step toward him, to touch him, to hold him, but his gaze, clear and distant, stopped her like a wall. He stood, his figure tall, strong but not threatening. There was a freedom about him that she could not understand. John looked at her for a moment longer, as if saying goodbye not to her, but to the part of himself that had once belonged to her. Then he turned and walked into the house, his steps soft but final, like the sound of a door closing. Emily remained standing, her body racked with sobs, the wind, salty and sharp, hitting her cheeks as if it wanted to wake her. She looked out at the empty terrace, at the book he had left behind, at the ocean that continued its eternal movement, indifferent to her pain. She knew this was the end, not just of their marriage, not just of their story, but of something bigger, something she would never get back. She turned, her legs stumbling, and walked toward the car, her tears mixing with the sand, leaving a trail that would soon be washed away by the tide. John stood on a cliff overlooking the ocean, a lonely figure but not lost. The wind whipped through his hair, the sun, already setting, painted his skin a warm gold, and the waves below crashed against the rocks, their rhythm as ancient as time itself. He had come here after Emily had gone, not because he sought solace, but because this place, open and wild, was now his home. He breathed in the salt air, feeling it fill his lungs, washing away the last vestiges of her presence, her words, her tears. Her appearance did not surprise him. He knew that she could come, that her pain, her regret would seek him out as a shadow seeks light. But he felt neither anger nor pity, only a calm as deep as the sea before him. Emily was his past, his lesson, his pain, but she was no longer his chain. He looked at the horizon, where the sky merged with the water, and a slight, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. Not malice, not revenge, not longing freedom. He was free not from her, but from who he was with her, from dependence, from illusions, from the love that blinded him. John crouched down, picked up a smooth, wave-polished stone, and held it in his hand. He didn't think about her, didn't think about what she had said, or how she looked, beaten down, exhausted, broken. He thought about himself, about his dawn runs, the books he had read, the breathing he had learned to control. He thought about how pain had made him stronger, how betrayal had hardened him, how loneliness had become a gift rather than a punishment. He swung the stone into the ocean, watching it disappear into the waves, leaving no trace. He stood up, his gaze fixed on the sunset, and in his face, illuminated by the last rays of the sun, there was no trace of the past. Only a calm as clear as the sky above him, and a strength that was born of his own rebirth. He turned and walked down the path, his steps light, sure, like those of a man who knows where he is going. Some women teach us how to love. Others teach us how to love ourselves. Thank you for being on the receiving end of this story. Wherever you listen at home, on the road, on a walk, you are part of our cozy community. Subscribe to stay up to date with the next episode, and let us know in the comments what topics you're interested in. We'll hear you. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.